So good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting Royalty Stat to come talk to you a little bit about IP evaluation and transfer pricing. Let's see here. Well, I'm going to start the presentation with a few premises that I'm sure it's well known for everyone in the room, but just so we have an idea of where we're going to start and where we're going to end with the presentation. And of course, we only have a few minutes to discuss, and we have way more topics to talk about and discuss when it comes to IP and transfer pricing, and when it comes to IP in general. But to go to the point of the presentation, IP evaluation can be done for several purposes. It can be done for M&As, it can be done for purchase price allocations, it can be done for transfer pricing. In this presentation, we will talk more about IP evaluation in the transfer pricing world. And transfer pricing, as you all know, involves the cross-border transfer of intangibles between affiliated companies. Transfer pricing rules are put in place mainly for two purposes. First, to ensure that related parties have tax parity with unrelated parties, and the second, to avoid double taxation. We've seen several movements around the world to enforce transfer pricing rules, and the OECD now has come up with the BAPs as well to try to enforce it even further and to make sure that the big multinationals are paying the taxes that they own, and to the multinationals, the BAPs would come up to the point that they would avoid some type of double taxation. But we're still to see if that's going to come up as true or not. The transfer of an intangible can take two forms. It can take the form of a sale, or it can take the form of a license. A sale is when we transfer all the rights to a third party, and the license is when you're still the owner of the intangible, but you grant the rights to use, make, sell, or whatever it is that you negotiate with the party that you're licensing the intangibles for. There is a big fuss about the definition of intangibles, and it's not something that it's settled, or I don't think that's near settlement about what we're going to consider as an intangible or not. We even have competing definitions in the same jurisdiction system, like we have a definition of intangibles in the legal system, in the accounting system, in the tax, for tax purposes. Here on the screen you have a comparative view of the definitions of intangibles in the 482 regulations of the US, and the definition of intangibles with the OECD guidelines. There are a few things that are very similar, a few things that are still very different. And we are raising questions if we want the intangible definition to be broader or if we want it to be narrower. The big discussion right now is, are we going to include assets like workforce in place, or are we going to include assets like location savings? Those are topics that are being discussed frequently in every intangible forum that we go to, and it's part of the OECD agenda to also try to develop a better intangibles definition. And there are way more questions than answers at this point regarding the definition. But we need to keep working and trying to work with the rules that we have so far. So we're left to compare and try to adjust these different definitions and systems in everything that we're doing. When we do the transfer of intangibles and in the terms of a license, we have to find comparable license agreements to determine the value of that intangible that we're licensing. And there's a few challenges on what we should use and what we should search and what's acceptable as comparable agreements when you're dealing with IP. I did a search, and I was trying to, because we always hear that intangibles are hard to value, but the question is, what type of intangibles are hard to value? And also, are intangibles harder to find comparables than companies? In fact, the research that we do is that there are many more license agreements than there are companies that can be used as comparables. I just give an example here of a pharmaceutical search with agreements that have royalty rates. We found in our database over 3,000 agreements, and you can see the quartiles here. And for the manufacturing of pharmaceutical compounds, we only have 581 companies. So there is a greater number of agreements than there are of companies when when we're trying to find comparables to determine the value of intangibles than to find comparables for companies. A few challenges in finding comparables for intangibles. There are restrictive disclosing rules around the world, and we are outside here at the booth, and several of you attendants are coming to us and asking, do you have agreements in India? Do you have agreements that are from Indian companies? Can I use the agreements in your database? And the answer that we have is that as long as we know, as far as we know, the US is the only country that requires companies to file and to make public their license agreements. So far we have only been able to collect agreements from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. That doesn't mean it's only US agreements. We have agreements from several Indian companies. We have several agreements also covering India. But the restrictive disclosure rules that we find, and you all find, around the world is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to finding comparable license agreements. They exist, but they are not available to the general public. In that argument, in that point, most of the companies, they don't even get to reveal their agreements. Because only material agreements are required to be filed. And the definition of materiality is a legal definition, but still leaves room for a lot of, it's not a very straightforward definition. So it leaves a lot of room for the companies to decide if they're going to file or not. And even if they file, the vast majority of agreements filed are granted confidential treatment. So we might even have the agreement available, but it's full of dots and asterisks throughout the text, so they are no use for us. A few other challenges. Intangibles tend to have a high profit potential, and it may generate excess profits. The revenue authorities around the world tend to think that's an automatic or a very direct relationship. So if you have intangibles, you must have excess profit. That's not always true. We know that not all intangibles generate excess profit, and we've seen that from other panelists, including the ones this morning, that only 3 to 5% of the patents filed are valuable patents. So how can we expect that only because a company has intangibles or has a big portfolio of intangibles, it needs to generate excess profit? It's not always a direct relationship. There are also several different types of contractual terms that may influence the royalty rate. You may have exclusivity, you may have different territories, and you may have additional payments. Especially in the pharmaceutical industry, we know that the bulk of the payments are paid with milestone payments, not necessarily royalty rates. So there are several things to consider when we are also choosing comparable license agreements. And when we talk about the royalty rates, there is even the issue of complex payment structures. So you can have a tiered payment, you can have them based on net sales or gross profit. So there are several things to consider when we're going to use the agreements. And there are several challenges to using the agreements as comparable. Well, talking specifically about royalty rates, the complex structures, just want to check here the time, okay. There are two types of royalty rate structures. The simple structure, that's a simple rate, or the complex structures that include a fixed payment and a royalty rate that's usually based on the revenue. So whenever we are going to find comparable agreements and we are going to use those for our IP valuation, we need to control not only for the industry, not only for the type of intangible, not only for the rights conferred, but it's important for us to consider all forms of payment. So if you're going to look into an agreement, it has, most of them have a royalty rate based on revenue and also additional payments. You need to consider that complex payment structure to determine the value of that intangible being licensed. Well, here are a few factors that, that we use when we're trying to find comparables. So the comparability standards go through the analysis of exclusivity, duration, territory, upfront fees, milestone payments, and the form of the royalty rate. And just to give you an idea, I've pulled out some charts from the royalty stat database for us to know how these factors may influence or not the median royalty rates from a pool of agreements. So I did a sample search on pharmaceutical, mostly ophthalmology agreements, including patents and know-how, with royalties based on net sales and excluding related parties. For transfer pricing, that part is very important. We found 74 agreements. The median is around 8%. The average is 8.8%. And we found a few outliers as well. And if we exclude those outliers, the median and the average drops. The quartiles are roughly the same. And we have charts. This chart indicates that the agreements that have an exclusive license have significantly higher royalty rates than the agreements that have non-exclusive licenses. We see that the median is around 10% for the exclusive and around 5.5% for non-exclusive. The duration may also influence the royalty rate. So we see here that agreements with 10 and 12 years have roughly similar royalty rates, but the agreements with lower duration may have lower royalty rates. We can also make an analysis based on the region that this agreement